Hutton wrote a book in 1795, and people began to doubt the earth was 6,000 years old. Charlie Lyell wrote a book in 1830, and people began to doubt the flood, and Charlie Darwin's book made people doubt the Creator. And by the mid-1800s, people were wondering, wow, if God didn't do it, how did we get here? Who's in charge of the world?
Well, to be fair, plenty of people already realized that the earth was ancient long before then, and lots of people doubted the flood before then, too. In fact, most people around the world had never even heard of that flood legend to begin with. And plenty of evolutionary scientists still believe in God to this day. But it doesn't matter what anyone believes. Is it true? Can we show the truth of it? That's what matters.
That led directly to the rise of communism, Marxism, socialism, Nazism. We'll cover that on Seminar Part 5. Politically incorrect, the dangers of this evolution theory.
Remember that when this preacher says evolution, he really means all the theories that contradict the biblical narrative. So his issue is with science in general. And when he says Darwinian evolution led directly to all of these socio-political ideologies, what that really means is no, it didn't have anything to do with any of that at all. The preacher just likes to invoke Godwin's law, that the longer an argument goes on, the more likely someone will draw a comparison with Nazis or Hitler, leading to an ad hominem fallacy known as reductio ad Hitlerum, an attempt to invalidate someone's position on the basis that Hitler had the same view. That tactic often backfires, and it is often interpreted that the first one to bring up Nazis is losing the argument.
Now, Darwin didn't originate the evolution theory. It was around before him. He just simply made it popular, okay?
Other people already knew that new species had to be evolving somehow, but Darwin did the research to vindicate the first known working mechanism.
But Timothy was warned by Paul here in 1 Timothy 6. You be careful about avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science falsely so called.
If only such believers were capable of self-reflection, then the preacher would realize that the line he just cited applies to himself. Not that Paul even knew what science was. He was a mystic who thought that dreams were telepathic communication from beings not of this world, so he wasn't exactly rational.
Evolution is not science.
As I already said to this preacher in the introduction to this series, given an official declaration by the National Academy of Sciences, along with numerous other scientists and science organizations and scientifically competent Christians, versus your uneducated anti-intellectual bias, I think I'm going to have to side with the experts who say that evolution definitely is part of science.
Evolution's a religion in every sense of the word.
Evolution is not a religion in any sense of the word, and I can prove it. But the final episode of this series is all about that, so I will save my detailed rebuttal of that nonsense until then. For now, I'll just remind you that creationists often make this false accusation, trying to create the illusion of false equivalence, going for the tu quoque fallacy, pretending that you do it too, you're just as bad, even when we don't, and we're not.
Hitler said, let me control the textbooks, I'll control the state.
I can find no citation where Hitler ever said that. I know it wasn't in Mein Kampf. That's where Hitler explained that he was a creationist. Hitler had the same view that this preacher does. He accepted only microevolution, saying that evolution can only occur within definite limits, producing only subtle variants within their kind. He said that new diversity is limited to rare and inviable hybrids between those kinds, and he said that the emergence of new species is impossible, and that belief in macroevolution is a sin against the eternal Creator. Doubtless that's why the Nazis burnt Darwin's books. But even if Hitler didn't actually say all that about controlling the textbooks, I know that the Texas State Board of Education has said something similar, and they had the same belief as his preacher, too. They tried to misrepresent, denigrate, and distort science, sex, and social studies classrooms in order to promote religious right conservatism and the lie of American exceptionalism. Messages very similar to the ones the preacher and Hitler both promoted, because Hitler always only ever identified as a Christian, both publicly and privately, and he repeatedly criticized atheism. He also objected to accusations that he was irreligious, insisting that he was convinced of Christianity and that he would not allow any other religion to be promoted. He said that secular schools can never be tolerated because such a school has no religious instruction, and a general moral instruction without a religious foundation is built on air. Consequently, all character training and religion must be derived from faith. He said, we need believing people. Having that the preacher and Hitler turned out to have so much in common, it's no surprise that the preacher wants to control textbooks, to take out the facts that he doesn't want to believe, that he is mislabeled as lies.
Professor Wilson at Harvard University said, "As were many persons from Alabama, I was a born-again Christian. When I was 15, entered the Southern Baptist Church with great fervor and interest in the fundamentalist religion. I left at 17 when I got to the University of Alabama and heard about evolution theory." He lost his faith, first year of college. That's what happened to Philip Wentworth. Studied for the ministry at Harvard, lost his faith, gave up on the ministry. That's what happened to Scott. He almost lost his faith till somebody showed him one of my videotapes. And he said, "Oh, man, you saved my faith, Brother Hovind." This, Marty wrote me and said, "I want to let you know your ministry has been a blessing to me. I'm one of the high school students in the anthropology class that is a victim of the dangers of evolution teaching. I was very discouraged and questioned the existence of God. I listened to your seminars and that completely encouraged me, and it was a blessing to me." Yay, rescued one. It's amazing how many thousands of people down through history have lost their faith because of this evolution teaching.
If the real reason anyone ever rejected evolution was this preacher's seminars, wherein everything he ever says is wrong, being bigoted, ignorant, deceptive, and false, then I hope someone will put me in touch with those people, because I could still help them.
Karl Marx studied, said he wanted to serve God with his life, went off to college, became an evolutionist. Comrade Stalin, there was a special this afternoon on TV. How many saw that about Comrade Stalin on the History Channel? He went to a Christian school, read Darwin's book, and became an atheist. Killed between 60 and 100 million of his own people.
This preacher and many more propagandists like him want you to think that learning evolution causes atheism, and that atheism causes immoral behavior. That's why he links these things together as if there is a correlation. But there can't be, because the truth is that Stalin rejected Darwin's theory vehemently. Politics, however, can be even less rational than religion, and Stalinist communism certainly was. Those who embrace authoritarianism often buy into pseudoscience as well, and Stalin did, believing Lamarckism rather than Darwinism. Lamarckism was a belief in acquired characteristics, that giraffes stretching their necks to reach higher leaves would somehow cause their young to be born with longer necks. Although this notion failed in every capacity compared to Darwinian evolution, Lamarckism remained popular with authoritarians in the 20th century because it allowed ambitious men to imagine that their strength of will would control not only their destiny, but their progeny too, as if a man working out with weights would bear stronger children. In practical application, it's like thinking that chopping the tails off of mice would cause their young to be born without tails, or that stripping all the leaves off of a plant would cause the next generation to grow without leaves. And both of those experiments were done repeatedly before eventually being declared failures. But not in Russia. To secure the illusion of man's psychological control over biological development, his own and that of other organisms, Soviet agronomist Trofim Lysenko denounced Mendelian genetics as a capitalist myth. He didn't believe that genes existed. Instead, he believed that he could train agricultural crops to sprout at certain times by subjecting them to unnatural conditions, like soaking them in freezing water in the wrong season and other such things. And he claimed that the descendants of these experimental crops would somehow remember the conditions to which their ancestors had been subjected, and that these plants would obediently follow those cues. Lysenko also said that planting crops further north every year would cause them to get used to a colder climate. There is strong suspicion that he and others must have faked experimental results and destroyed counter-evidence in order to secure official backing. Joseph Stalin wrote and promoted Lamarckian propaganda, believing that Homo Sovieticus, the ideal communist, could be created through a totalitarian psychology rather than through breeding. In other words, ignore genetics and instead control what the people know and what they believe. So Stalin had something in common with this preacher too. But he also had the power to implement and enforce his madness. And consequently, Russian dictionaries were rewritten to describe genes as mythical concepts. And those identified as dissenting Darwinians, those who accepted Darwin's theory, were dismissed and gulagged, left destitute, or they were otherwise eliminated by the Soviet secret police. Stalin took over all Russia's farms and modernized them, making them state-run, and he put Lysenko in charge of all agricultural practices. Lysenko changed everything. He disallowed fertilizers or pesticides, and he ordered that all seeds be planted too close together for any of them to survive, because he believed in what he called the law of life of species, that food crops somehow belonged to the working class, so they would not compete against each other, as if plants were politically motivated to help each other survive, even when there isn't enough nutrients in the soil, no fertilizer to feed so many sprouts in one place. Just think of the cost of all those seeds that were wasted just to die and rot. It's all just as stupid as watering your fields with Brawndo, but this idiocracy really happened, and a lot of people died because of it. The widespread famine that resulted from Lysenko's pseudoscience practices led to the starvation of 7 million Russian farmers and at least 30 million Chinese farmers who also adopted those practices, because Chairman Mao believed in Lamarckian Lysenkoism too. None of these dictators believed in Darwinian evolution, and tens of millions of people died because of their unreasonable, unquestionable, authoritarian beliefs. And consequently, the famine persisted for many years, even after dedicating more and more land to farms, yet still producing less yield. Thus, Trofim Lysenko just might have killed more people than anyone else in human history, all because of his rejection of evolution in favor of unscientific beliefs held without reason and against all reason.
Andrew Carnegie became an evolutionist reading Darwin's book. He said it freed him from the shackles of religion. Light came in as a flood, and all was clear. Not only had I got rid of theology and the supernatural, but I found the truth of evolution. Carnegie left behind millions of dollars to make sure evolution is taught in our schools instead of creation. He funded the National Center for Science Education.
So Carnegie read Darwin's book, became an atheist because of it, and instead of killing anyone, he devoted his life and his wealth to philanthropy, with special emphasis on local libraries, world peace, education, and scientific research. Clutch my pearls. So I guess one message we could take from that is read Darwin's book, accept it, and become a great guy for all of humanity, or reject it and kill a bunch of people with weapons-grade stupidity.
The list is really long. We'll have to quit now. But 75% of kids from Christian homes that go to public schools lose their faith after 1 year of college.
Well, that's what happens when you grow up in the church and you're constantly fed political propaganda mixed with pseudoscientific nonsense, all of it designed to limit what and how you think. Because of reaction to and rejection of much of public education, most folks don't find out what science really is until they get to college. And then they realize how they've been lied to all their lives. Especially if you were raised fundamentalist, wherein giving up your faith means accepting reality. Now, some people like to make believe things that aren't really true, but that's not the case for everyone. For some folks, truth still matters. So they want actual factual information instead of false propaganda that you're expected to believe on faith.
What's in these textbooks anyway? What are they teaching our kids that's making them lose their faith?
What are we teaching? Demonstrable, verifiable reality. Accurate information with practical application. The truth is what the facts are, so that's what we should be teaching.
There is no known evidence to support the evolution theory except things that have been proven wrong a long time ago.
But notice that this preacher will never be able to show when, where, or how any of this was disproved. He just says it was, and you're supposed to nod your head in agreement.
If real evidence exists for this evolution theory, I would like to see it. We've been offering $250,000 for real scientific evidence for evolution. We've had that offer for over 10 years. There isn't any, okay?
I myself tried to answer that challenge way back then, but I couldn't because it wasn't what the preacher advertised. Evidence is a body of objectively verifiable facts that are positively indicative of and or exclusively concordant with one available position or hypothesis over any other. And there are many facts concordant with and supportive of evolution and that also contradict creationism. But the way the preacher set up this bogus sham was when you click the link to accept the challenge to present your evidence, then all the definitions changed. Because you see an admission by the preacher that he's not talking about what evolution really is. Instead, he's talking about his own personal straw man of the origins of the universe and of chemicals and so on, wherein the instructions also changed, such that instead of giving evidence of evolution, you have to prove that God could not have done it, which not only ignores the fact that many evolutionary scientists believe that God was involved in our evolution, but it's logically impossible to disprove God, not only because it requires proving a negative, but also because this God is described as having infinite magical power, and by definition, he can do anything he wants. So how could you prove that he couldn't do something? Not only that, but if you could make that argument, it would be philosophical, not scientific. So the preacher constructed a bait-and-switch scam where there was no way to present scientific evidence of evolution and receive that money. Instead, you were forced to present arguments instead of evidence, disproving God instead of supporting evolution, and whatever you did submit would be allegedly reviewed by a panel of anonymous judges who could not be identified, much less vetted or questioned. So all submissions could be summarily dismissed without any reason given. And in this episode, you're going to hear a few examples of the fallacious excuses that the preacher would have used.
Give an example. Suppose I had a theory that the moon is made of green cheese. Now that's a dumb theory, I know. But hey, it's okay to have a dumb theory. There are no laws against dumb theories. But then suppose I started teaching my students, hey kids, did you know NASA proved my theory in 1973 when they went there on a secret mission and drilled a hole and found the moon is made of green cheese? Oh, now hold on a minute. It's okay to have a dumb theory. It's not okay to lie about my evidence for my theory, okay?
Then you shouldn't have done this seminar. You shouldn't have said that evolution isn't the science that professors and textbooks all say that it is. You shouldn't have used all those mind quotations of things those folks never really said. You shouldn't have dismissed all those verifiable facts as lies, and you shouldn't have claimed frauds and hoaxes as evidence of your position. You shouldn't have said that the Grand Canyon was carved in a half hour when your own citation says otherwise. You shouldn't have said that there are polystrate trees found upside down or growing through multiple coal seams. You shouldn't have said that radiometric dating is circular reasoning when you know how that undermines your argument. And you shouldn't have said that the geologic column doesn't exist while showing photographs of it. You shouldn't have said that they found blood cells in dinosaur fossils or human hands in Cretaceous strata or shoe prints crushing trilobites. You shouldn't have said that the petrified forest was chopped down by some guy before turning to stone. You shouldn't have said that mummies were turned to stone. You shouldn't have said that dinosaurs are lizards, or that isopods are trilobites, or that concretions are fossils, or that evolution is a religion, and you shouldn't have lied about evolutionary theory having to include the Big Bang or involving changes in kinds, especially not when you yourself believe that one kind of bear diversified into 8 different kinds. You shouldn't contradict yourself like that. And nor should you have said that evolution teaches that we came from a rock, because it never taught that. At no point did life ever come from any form of stone or aggregate of minerals. So you should stop claiming things you can't demonstrate to be true.
So I don't mind if they want to have a theory that we came from a rock. That doesn't bother me. It does bother me that they want to lie to the students about their evidence, and it really bothers me that I have to pay their salary while they lie to spread their theory.
It's funny that this preacher complained about his taxes paying the salaries of public school teachers just before he spent a decade in prison for tax evasion.
So, here's some of the evidence they use for evolution theory. They say, we have evidence from fossils. I say, guys, you got to be kidding. No fossil counts as evidence for evolution. None. If you find bones in the dirt, all you know is it died. You don't know it had any kids. No fossil could count as evidence for evolution. None.
When you find a bone in the dirt, it doesn't just mean that something died. That fossil also tells you that it lived, that it was able to survive to that level of maturity. And the type of fossil tells you what kind of animal it was, and that there must have been more than just one of them. Another of the many things that fossils actually do tell us is that animals used to be very different than they are now. And this will come up again, but it needs to be said now. Darwin made 2 specific predictions of what we should find in the fossil record if evolution is true, and only if evolution is true. And one is that his friend Thomas Huxley had pointed out a growing list of similarities between dinosaurs and birds. One of them being that the wings of modern birds look like they might have been made out of the 3 fingers of dinosaurs that were fused together. So Darwin said that if birds had evolved from dinosaurs, as Huxley suggested, and all modern birds subsequently inherited this mutation of fused fingers, then there must have been an early fossil bird with unfused wing fingers that it could still use. Now, paleognathe birds have fingers, although they're unusable, and the Hoatzin is a very primitive type bird that still has functional fingers as an infant, and they get fused together as it matures, following a pattern of evolutionary phylogeny. But if no flying bird has fingers today, then there shouldn't be any 3-fingered birds in the fossil record either, unless they evolved from an earlier form, like velociraptors that still used their fingers. in which case there wouldn't be just one of these fossil birds. And Darwin knew that if this transition happened, that there would be a whole population, maybe several different species like that. We just needed to find one of them, any one of them, to prove that that sort of bird existed. It didn't have to be that first one or any particular individual, so it wouldn't matter whether that fossil had any kids. Evolution made a prediction that there should be birds with clawed reptilian fingers in their wings. And then 2 years later, while Darwin was still alive, they found the first of many such fossils of several different species, proving that Darwin and Huxley were right and that the preacher is wrong again.
They say we have evidence from structure, from molecular biology, from development. Well, let's talk about a few of these. Evolution is dead. The theory is defunct. There is no evidence to support it. But some of the followers are pretty dedicated, and they're having a hard time letting it go. They'll even lie to you to make you think everything's fine. They say, wow, look at that evolution theory. It's perfectly fine. There's no challenge to evolution. Look, he never looked better. Pulse and heart rate look good. No, I'm sorry. He's a goner, okay? Don't be the last one off the boat. It is sinking.
Did you notice that the preacher just said he was going to talk about the evidence of homology, morphology, embryology, and genetics, all of which is significant, and it'll come up later, which is good because he didn't talk about any of that at all. Instead, he ignored that whole list of evidence of evolution to pretend that there is none, without giving any reason as to why he dismisses all of that without consideration. Instead, he changed the subject to repeat the false claim that evolution is a theory in crisis, which creationists have been saying for 100 years or so at least, even though every poll of this topic over that same period consistently shows the opposite trend, where evolution is always being more accepted and better supported over time. Remember that this seminar was recorded in 2005. The number of regular people who accept evolution has risen from 3/5 of the population then to 3/4 now. And back then, 97% of scientists accepted evolution, and now 99% of PhD scientists and 99% of research scientists all say that humans have evolved. At the same time, the biologists and geologists who give credence to creationism has dwindled to less than 1%, just a little bit more than 1/10 of 1%. So no, evolution is not a theory in crisis, and evolutionists are not the ones lying about that. We have the data to back it up. Whereas, once again, the preacher is making unsupported assertions that are directly counter to what the data actually indicates.
Evolution is based on two faulty assumptions. Number one, they say mutations make something new. That's never been observed.
That has been observed many times, though not the way the preacher imagines, because mutations in real life don't look like what we'd see in X-Men comics.
Number two, natural selection makes it survive and take over the population.
Remember that this preacher accepts natural selection, and he can even give an almost adequate explanation of it.
Creationists don't have any argument with natural selection. We thought of it first, okay? So God gave all the creatures a gene code with a variety of options coming out in the babies. Some might have longer hair, some may have shorter hair, some longer legs, some shorter legs, and gradually over many generations, the ones that are best suited to that environment will survive and take over that area. So the dogs with long hair survive better in Alaska, and the dogs with short hair, thin legs, thin body survive better in the desert, like the dingo. That's not evolution. It is natural selection.
So what the preacher calls a faulty assumption is something that he himself assumes. Is he admitting that his own assumption is faulty? Of course, the variety of options that he admits to is provided by mutations, which he will not admit. And what he does not or will not understand is that evolution at every level is an accumulation of usually minor changes, differentiating one group into two. It is never one thing turning into another fundamentally different kind of thing like he wants to pretend.
Evolution is actually a religion of death.
This is another demonstration of the pot calling the silverware black. The preacher represents what has been described as a death cult for the reason that it requires a blood sacrifice to achieve salvation from an eternal torture, which is itself a posthumous promise that will only come after you die. Yet in another distortion of projection, the preacher makes this accusation against a theory on the origin and preservation of species in the struggle for life, as if that was the death cult.
In order for evolution to work, one animal evolves a little better than the rest. What must happen to the rest of them to make this thing work?
Nothing has to happen to the rest of them because evolution is a scientific theory of biodiversity. where one species becomes 2, then 4, then 8, and 16, and so on, excepting for those that go extinct if they do, which doesn't happen that often, because how else would we have accumulated hundreds of thousands of species of moths and butterflies, for example, each one being their own collection of unique mutations?
They got to die, or else the new improved gene is swamped back into the gene code.
Part of the issue here is that the preacher thinks that every new variety has to be new and improved. It doesn't. It's just any variation. And natural selection isn't always applied because most mutations are neutral and don't necessarily affect viability or reproduction. But since the preacher refuses to accept mutation as a source of variation, then he has no concept of the mechanism of genetic drift. Here's how I explained that to him during our debate a few years ago. Natural selection was only the first working mechanism ever proposed for evolution, but it isn't the only one. We know of a few of them now. Genetic drift, for example, is much more significant. This is an important lesson, so I'll recap this later on because it bears repeating. But to explain, mutations are much more frequent than you may imagine. For example, the molecular clock measures significant mutation rates, which vary depending on whether they're genomic or mitochondrial, and those are just the mutations that count for significant effect. Mutations don't work like they do in movies and comic books, where one mutation causes a whole suite of changes. It usually takes quite a few mutations to see any appreciable difference at all. And natural selection is a process of population genetics and only acts on those mutations that have an impact on performance or reproduction. Deleterious mutations tend to be eliminated from the gene pool very quickly, if not immediately. Beneficial mutations have a preferential advantage, but even with that, it could still take generations to see those changes spread throughout the population. There are many more mutations that are insignificant and neutral. Now, according to this study, humans average 128 mutations per zygote. That's just the ones that every one of us has to start with right from the point of conception, because each cell has the potential for further mutation every time it undergoes mitosis. But those are somatic. Evolution is driven only by heritable mutations, being those that are passed down through the gamete cells, which are then replicated from the first division of the zygote and continuing throughout the development of the organism. So every pair of fraternal siblings already has an average of 256 mutation differences between them. Now, these are cumulative, but they can't build up exponentially because the parent gene pool has a tendency to restrict the degree of variance that can occur within the population. So those new and novel mutations will be effectively suppressed in the next generation, just as a matter of population mechanics, because of the recombination with other sexual partners. The norm usually overrides the aberration. But genetic isolation of relatively small groups now outside the influence of the dominant gene pool relaxes that restriction, allowing more mutations to accumulate with greater frequency. And these changes quickly build up to distinguish outgroups from their ancestral or sister groups, so that in just a few generations, you'd be able to recognize which group some individual belongs to, and this is without any requirement of improvement. There are a number of familiar examples that I'll go over in the recap later on. For the moment, remember that evolution isn't just about getting bigger and better all the time. It's a theory of biodiversity, meaning an ever-widening variety of increasingly different lineages. So to anthropomorphize this a bit, nature experiments with every generation going in every direction at once. This is how it is, and why I say that evolution is usually a matter of incremental, usually subtle changes in physical or chemical proportion, not in one direction, but where every sibling could start a different direction, bigger or smaller, faster or tougher, with any body part being a different length and or shape and running the spectrum of red and green, whatever. If those initially tiny changes don't have any significant impact on survival or procreation, then natural selection will not apply, and they're free to diverge into myriad varieties, such as the hundreds of thousands of lepidopterans, for example, with the different types of antennae seen on butterflies, skippers, and moths.
The question is so simple and profound. Did man bring death into the world like the Bible says? Or did death bring man into the world like evolution says? Somebody is wrong.
I'm going to guess that the one who is still wrong is the one who has always been wrong on every single point he's tried to make so far. It doesn't even surprise me that he hasn't adequately studied his own mythology. I know both sides of this argument better than he knows his own alone. I don't think I've ever had this discussion with this preacher, but here's how I explain this to his son. Notice that the anonymous author of Genesis does not ever imply in any way that there was no death before the fall. In fact, Adam and Eve were given food and required to eat in order to survive. There's something else too. something obvious, clearly written into the text, but that your interpretation cannot acknowledge or account for. And while you imagine all kinds of things that your Bible does not say, you're missing what it really does say. And notice that the fictional characters of Adam and Eve were given a clear choice between two options, both of them right in the middle of the garden. They could either eat of the fruit of the tree of life and remain as they were forever, or they could eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, in which case they would become like unto the gods, a fact which Jehovah later admitted. This story can only be interpreted figuratively. Its only possible value or truth is metaphorical. And whenever the Bible talks about the fruit of, it's always a metaphor, referring to results of actions taken or decisions made. Only in Genesis is that phrase taken literally, and it shouldn't be even there, or not especially there. The tree of life and the tree of knowledge were meant to be understood symbolically, not as actual trees that could be cut down and burnt. It means that if you discover knowledge and morality, then you can't be just like all the other animals anymore. You've become something more, like unto the gods. Most importantly, though, Jehovah said that he had to get Adam out of the garden in order to prevent him from eating of the fruit of the tree of life, because if Adam ate from that tree, then he would live forever, meaning, of course, that he would not live forever otherwise. So God hurried the couple out of the garden, and he assigned magical creatures with primitive but enchanted weapons to guard the tree. Against whom, I wonder? Because the implication is that we could get back there and live forever if we could sneak past the guards. And more importantly, Genesis 3:22-24 proves that Adam did not bring death into the world, nor could he have. If death did not already exist, then why would there be a tree of eternal life? Why would Adam need such a tree if he already had eternal life? Because remember, Adam was offered this choice before he allegedly sinned.
Textbook says there are mutations, and they are the original source of variation in populations. I agree, mutations happen, no question. But mutations do not produce any evolution. Mutations are scrambling up existing genetic code. They're not making anything new.
There are a few different types of mutation, and none of them scramble anything. They do change genetic information in different ways, which usually means changing proportions slightly, though they can have other effects too, such as the creation of novel gene function. For example, what has been hailed as the plastic-eating bacterial enzyme, new genetic information that is not only beneficial for the organism, but for us as well.
Here's a five-legged bull. That's a mutant. There's no new information added. He already had the information on how to make a leg. It just made one in the wrong place, that's all. It's not new information, it is scrambled information. Here's a short-legged sheep. Again, no new information. And by the way, that's not beneficial. He's the first one the wolf is going to catch. Right? Go, boys, go. Here comes the wolf. Brrr. Oh, Herman didn't make it. There's a two-headed lamb. That's a mutant. It's not beneficial. Two-headed turtle. That's a mutant. Not ninja, but it's mutant. Okay. Now, he's going to freeze first winter because nobody makes a double-neck turtleneck sweater. He's just not going to make it. No.
No sheep can outrun a wolf, no matter how long its legs are. The rest of these, the five-legged bull and the two-headed things, are not mutants. It's much worse than that. These are twins, conjoined twins, but where one is mostly consumed or absorbed by the other and has no life of its own. It's a nightmarish configuration, a life in anguish that you'd think God would prevent, but he allows that sort of thing to happen.
Scrambling up the letters of the word Christmas will get you all sorts of different words, but it will never get you Xerox, zebra, or queen. The letters aren't available.
But genetic information is not in letters. The letters are just abbreviations of the chemicals involved, with different configurations of them, producing different proteins and having an incredibly wide range of potential effects, including the generation of new genes, to increase complexity and to add new genetic information.
This textbook shows the kids a four-wing fly, which, by the way, cannot fly, and it says, boys and girls, normal fruit flies have 2 wings. This mutant has 4. This rare mutation, like most mutations, is harmful. Then it says, beneficial mutations are the raw material for natural selection. Now, hold on a minute. Why don't they show us an example of a beneficial mutation? Why did they tell us about the good ones and not show us a picture of a good one? You know why they didn't show a picture of a good mutation? because nobody's ever seen one.
The eighth foundational falsehood of creationism is the claim that
there's never been one beneficial mutation.
And it's a strange claim because there are so many examples to disprove it. But creationists can't admit that because they can't admit that life can design or improve itself incidentally, unintelligently, as an emergent pattern of imperfect reproduction. Remember that the preacher said he has hundreds of textbooks from public schools, meaning the ones aimed at children rather than college students, and most of his books are at least a few decades out of date. And maybe that's why he is somehow unaware of the standard list of beneficial mutations that are found in our current high school biology textbooks. Now try to imagine taking a picture of any of these mutations as the preacher demands. There would be no point in it because it wouldn't look like a comic book. And my son was in a class with a teacher like this preacher who passed out the textbooks and told the kids that there's never been a beneficial mutation. My son already knew better and he had the book open to show. But teacher, beneficial mutations are listed right here. And my son was sent to the office for insubordination. But the point is that even when they know there are beneficial mutations, they still won't admit it. Because it's not about what the truth really is. It's about what they want to believe instead.
I said that in a debate one time, and this atheist said, "Hovind, you're lying." He said, "I can name a beneficial mutation right now." He said, "People in Africa that get sickle cell anemia are less likely to get malaria." I said, "That's brilliant, sir. That's like saying if you cut off your legs, you can't get athlete's foot." They're both negative, okay?
The standard list of beneficial mutations found on educational sources varies a bit because there are so many options to choose from. All of them are significant if you're sincerely interested in understanding biology. But if you're afraid to understand that and are more concerned with dismissing even the possibility of beneficial mutations, then none of these examples are going to matter to you, because they mostly concern microbes and fruit flies, things that are easy to work with in a lab. So I came up with my own list of beneficial mutations in people, things that cause resistance to heart disease or immunity from particular viruses and so on. For example, there's a mutation found in natives in the Andes that is different from, but similar to, another mutation in Tibetans in the Himalayas that allow both groups to endure prolonged periods at high altitudes without succumbing to apoplexia, also known as altitude sickness. And there's a PAX9 mutation that prevents impacted wisdom teeth. But in addition to these immunities, there are a couple more interesting mutations too. There are 8 types of a particular missense mutation in the LRP5 gene that usually has negative side effects. But there's one type that doesn't. It just gives you hyperdense, virtually unbreakable bones. Seriously. And there's another one where if a child gets a double copy of a particular myostatin mutation, they'll have twice the muscle mass and half the fat of regular kids, like being born literally as strong as an ape, with a superhero physique, even without spending a day in the gym. Now, if you had one person who had all of these mutations combined, then it would start to look like an X-Men comic.
Then they say evolution and natural selection go together. This one says natural selection causes evolution. That's a lie. Natural selection selects. It doesn't create anything. Natural selection is not a creative force, okay? Natural selection may be a stabilizing force, but it's not a creative force. Anybody with half a brain can figure that out. Natural selection cannot create any properties. It can only select.
Notice that Reverend Half-a-Brain is apparently forgetting his own description of natural selection.
Gradually, over many generations, the ones that are best suited to that environment will survive and take over that area.
That's how that happens. Mutations create the new varieties, and if these confer an advantage, they will be selected. That's how evolution and natural selection really do go together.
This textbook says, evolution by natural selection had occurred in just 1 year. Oh, they're lying.
The scientists have no reason to lie about that, but the preacher apparently does. Because remember that evolution is defined as a variance of allele frequencies in reproductive populations over time. That's what this is. And that natural selection comes in when the environment has an impact on variety, which is exactly what this article says. But the preacher wants to pretend that evolution isn't what it is, because he thinks that it should involve a change in kinds, which we know it doesn't. So he'll never admit that when evolution is observed, not even if it means contradicting himself, because he already said that he accepts natural selection and that he accepts microevolution. That's what this is. That's all it is. He agrees with this, and yet he says it's a lie?
Says natural selection can lead to evolution. That's a lie. Natural selection selects. It doesn't create a thing.
Read the text that he put on screen while you listen to his own words from our debate.
Gradually, over many generations, the ones that are best suited to that environment will survive and take over that area.
Isn't that exactly what this says? So how can he call this a lie if it's the same thing he said himself?
If you worked in a factory that made cars, how far is the Saturn plant from here? Pretty close, isn't it? How many of you work? Anybody here work in the Saturn plant? Okay. Suppose you worked in quality control. Your job was to check the car when they got done building it, kick the tires, slam the doors, and drive it around, see if it runs. If you caught every single mistake, they don't, by the way, but if you did, okay, how long would it take that quality control process to change the car to an airplane? You say, Hovind, quality control can't change it to something else. Oh, I know. Only design engineers can change it. And God's natural selection is a quality control that will never change it to a different animal. It'll just make sure you get a good animal, that's all.
Well, once again, the preacher is ignoring his own citations and logic as well, because his God's quality control was responsible for that two-headed turtle and five-legged cow. God's quality control should not allow mutations to slip through at all, yet they do. And the changes they make create new variety, though the preacher cannot admit that. Nor can he admit that evolution is not and does not allow one animal to change into a different kind of animal. He has a fundamental misunderstanding, a refusal to understand, accept, and admit what evolution really is.
They keep talking about survival of the fittest. Well, I agree, but that doesn't explain arrival of the fittest. And even survival of the fittest is pretty shaky. It's what's called a tautology, a sentence that means nothing. I'll show you. If you say, Professor, why did it survive? He'll say, oh, because it's the fittest, survival of the fittest. How do you know it's the fittest? Because it survived. How else can you tell? Oh, I see. Look, if a whale goes through a school of fish and eats 80% of them, it's not survival of the fittest. It's actually survival of the luckiest. That's what's really going on out there.
All of the preacher's examples show that he is extremely limited, thinking about only one individual animal changing into something else over a single lifetime, rather than understanding whole populations diversifying into different groups over many generations, where survival is a matter of efficiency, fine-tuning various parts of the body over many generations to leave them able to feed and sustain themselves long enough to reproduce and rear their young under the day-to-day conditions of that climate. Yet the preacher thinks it's all about a bug surviving a sledgehammer or having 80% of the population destroyed by a calamity. He does not and will not allow himself to admit what survival of the fittest even means, just like he won't admit what evolution really is or what mutations really do. He obviously doesn't want you to understand the truth about that either. Instead, he wants to make you believe something else.